Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. My name is Haley and I am your host. I work at an OBGYN clinic where I teach women and couples how to chart their cycles so they can either achieve or avoid pregnancy and also to manage their fertility. I have a huge passion to teach women and couples about the beauty of their fertility and how the pill is never the answer to women's health. There's a lot of good and not so good information out there about fertility. And so my goal with this podcast is to help you sort out the truth from the weeds. I want to teach you how to chart your cycle and to reach your family planning goals while also maybe even possibly locating hormonal imbalances and to receive proper treatment. I want to help you get in the best hands that you can with the best doctors that you can to reach optimal reproductive health. So if you're ready to get on this journey with me to learn more about your reproductive system, how it was created and how it should be working, and the best medicine in order to make it work if it's not, then you are in the right place. Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. So today we are doing part 2 of my Science of Dating series. So there are 3 parts. Last week we talked all about anatomy and hormones and really just laying the foundation for understanding how our bodies work and then how that can affect our dating life. So today is where we get into the fun stuff. We're going to actually talk about, okay, how do those hormones that I laid out for you last week, how do they actually play a part in our dating life? How do they affect us? Is there a difference between dating when our estrogen is high versus dating when our progesterone is high? Spoiler alert, there is. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to be talking about 3 main hormones again that can affect our dating life and specifically how they do. So 2 of the hormones I'm going to be talking about are similar or actually the same as to what I went over last week, estrogen and progesterone. These are the 2 main female sex hormones. And they play a huge part in our mood and how that affects our dating, right? Hugely affecting our dating life. So we'll talk about those. And then lastly, we're also going to talk about oxytocin, which is another hormone. I did not mention it last week, but it is also a very, very big deal when it comes to our bonding with other human beings and specifically with people that we're dating or our spouses or future spouses, right? So these are the 3 main ones that we are getting into today. So I'm going to start out with probably the most fun one to talk about, which is estrogen. Okay. So also too, really quick before I move into that, I forgot to mention a lot of this information I am getting from the book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. It's written by Sarah E. Hill, who is a PhD, and she wrote this book about how the female body is affected by the pill. I think it is an incredibly well-written book. So a lot of this information that I'm going to be giving you today and next week and even last week, a lot of it came from this book. Now, I gave this caveat last week, so I'll give it again just quickly right now, that I don't agree with every single thing that she says in this book. She and I have different moral codes, I think, especially when it comes to fertility and dating and all of those things. But nevertheless, it is incredible information. She lays things out so well. And I really do highly recommend it. Just kind of take some of the things she says with a grain of salt, especially if you have a Christian worldview. But she lays things out really well. So a lot of this information that I'm giving you today is coming from this book. So I'll put it in the show notes below if you want to go check that out. You can just get it on Amazon. But anywho, all right, let's now get into estrogen. So let's remember when estrogen is actually high, right? Estrogen is dominant or estrogen is high right during the time where we are fertile as women. So around the time of our ovulation. Now, if you have a very typical 30-day-ish cycle, that's going to be about the second week of your cycle, if your cycle is a month long, right? So after your period's, tailing off and ending, and then you're leading up into ovulation. So it's about a week for a woman who is regularly cycling. If you're getting into like irregular cycles and things, it's a little bit trickier to kind of pinpoint this time, but just for the sake of ease, let's talk about just a typical cycle. So this is about the second week of a 4-week cycle where your estrogen is at its peak. And estrogen is typically at its peak the day before ovulation. And remember that ovulation is when an egg is released from our ovary. And so if an egg is released from our ovary and we are having intercourse, that means that the possibility of conception is there, right? So the hormone estrogen, I talked a lot about how it affects, just talking about like the physiology of our body. Last week, I talked about how it affects like our cervical fluid and how sperm can live within our bodies for a certain days in order to hit the egg, right? I've already talked a lot about that and how physiologically conception actually occurs because of the fact of estrogens working on our body, working on our cervix, producing the cervical mucus or cervical fluid that we see, right? So there's that. But I want to get into the practicals of how does estrogen actually affect our mood, which would then affect our dating life, right? Affect who we're attracted to even, which is really insane. So the first thing I want to lay out is that estrogen increases our energy and our sex drive. And you can think about this in evolutionary terms, right? It's an evolutionary design for the continuation of the human species. It would make sense that when our estrogen is high, when we're around the time of fertility, if we had intercourse, there's a possibility of pregnancy. It would make good evolutionary sense that our sex drive would naturally be higher during this time, because for the continuation of our human species, we have to have intercourse. And so with that being said, it's a lot easier to have intercourse when you have a sex drive. So with that being said, estrogen increases your energy and increases your sex drive. So during this time of fertility, that's typically what we're experiencing. We're experiencing a higher libido due to this evolutionary design. Now, it also causes our brain cells to make new connections about ourselves and the way that we feel about ourselves, and also the way that we feel about other men. So this is really interesting. So there is some research that Sarah Hill outlines in her book that shows that during this time when estrogen is really high, during our fertile time, women actually, and to use her words, women actually feel sexier, and we have an increased motivation to look more attractive to men during the fertile time when estrogen is high. So we want to feel desired during this time. We want to feel, we want to have a deeper connection. We want to be looked at. We want to feel desired. We want to feel wanted during this time. And this isn't a bad thing. This is the way that our bodies are made. There are some times during our cycles that we feel more like this. We want to feel more attractive. That's a great thing. That's perfectly fine. We shouldn't sit here thinking like, oh, there's something wrong with you. Oh, you're vain. No. This is our body's natural way of continuing the human species, you guys. But on a different level than that, though, just with dating wise, during this time when our estrogen is high, we want to feel more attractive. So that's how we are seeing ourselves during this time. Now, what's interesting on the flip side of the coin is how we see other men. And this kind of blows your mind in the fact that you hear this and you're like, okay, that makes sense. But when you follow this trail of thinking, it really does blow your mind. Okay, let me actually tell you what this is. So during our fertile time, when our estrogen is high, not only does it cause us to want to feel more attractive or want to be more desired, but it also affects the type of man that we are attracted to, which is pretty crazy, actually. So I want to read verbatim from Dr. Sarah Hill's book really quick, because I can't say it better than she says it right here. For those of you that have the book, it's on page 57, kind of halfway through the page. She talks about how women are more attracted to men who have more symmetrical faces, who have broad shoulders, who have a square cut jawline, just the more like objectively masculine type man that we're in. Obviously I'm just talking about looks here, which can sound vain, but for the purpose of explaining this to you, this is what I'm saying. So what she says is that tall, symmetrical men with deep voices, ambition, and swagger cause our brain to produce beautiful fireworks that make us feel good because these qualities provide cues to things like health and developmental stability, which create more successful pregnancies and healthier children. And then she goes on to say, your brain has inherited a tendency to find sexy men sexy because your female ancestors, by exhibiting this same preference, were able to pass down genes to enough surviving children to get you where you are today. So it would make good evolutionary sense for women to have a heightened preference for sexy men at this time. I love it. It makes so much sense as to where our thoughts, feelings, actions are at during this time of fertility. We are more attracted to the typical masculine, quote unquote, sexy men, right, during this time because of our evolutionary background in making sure that our offspring and our pregnancies are as healthy as they possibly can be and have the best genes that they possibly can have, right? So now I want to outline another study that Dr. Sarah Hill talks about in her book. This is on page 59 for those of you that are reading along. But she talks about this study done on women specifically at 2 different times of their cycle. So they took women at their fertile time, so where they're high in estrogen, and then they took women at their infertile time. So when estrogen is not the dominant hormone, it's actually progesterone, which again, we'll get to here in a minute. But during these 2 different times of their cycle, in this study, they introduced these women to 2 different types of guys. So the first type, she calls them the charismatic bad boy type, which I say that I don't have to explain who that is, right? You guys all know. You can picture it in your mind. And then the second type, what she calls the Mr. Nice Guy type. So in this research study, they introduced these 2 different types of men to women either at their high point of their fertility, so when estrogen was very high, or at the low point of their fertility when they were not fertile, when they were infertile and progesterone was high. And they found that the women who were at their peak fertility were much more flirtatious and friendly to the bad boy type than the women who were at their lowest time of their fertility, which is really interesting. But the other thing that really intrigued me was that no matter what time of fertility the women were in, it did not change their interaction with the Mr. Nice Guy type, though. It didn't make them more or less interested in the Mr. Nice Guy type, but at women's peak when the women were at peak fertility, they were much more interested in the charismatic bad boy type. So with all of these research studies that she is laying out here, it just shows that estrogen has an incredibly high factor in who we're attracted to, how our dates probably go, and our actions towards these men that we're dating, right? So estrogen plays a huge part of that. Now, to just give you a little peek into next week's episode, where I'm going to be outlining how the pill changes all of this and how the pill changes and affects our dating life. When I'm talking about high estrogen right now, I'm talking about estrogen that's high at your time of fertility. Well, when you're on the pill or any hormonal contraceptive, your estrogen doesn't get this high because of the fact that it's suppressing your fertility. It's suppressing your ovulation. So you're not having this naturally high estrogen effect where you are really attracted to the quote unquote sexy man and you are really energetic and you have that high libido or high sex drive. The pill changes all of that. So earlier how I said, when you get to start thinking about how estrogen affects the type of man that you're attracted to, you can go down that rabbit hole because you start to understand how when you affect your hormones, especially with the use of hormonal contraceptives, that will affect the type of man that you are attracted to. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a glance into what next week's topic is going to be like, because that really is mind-blowing. And I think if it will change your mind on the pill if none of this has yet. But I'll save that for next week. Just knowing that estrogen, peak estrogen and your natural estrogen, that does everything that we already talked about. Okay. All right. Let's move then into progesterone. So progesterone is the progestation hormone. That's why it's called progesterone. And so everything about progesterone is for the sake of maintaining a human life. It is for the sake of, if you do get pregnant, for continuation of that pregnancy, for the continual growth of that human that's inside of you. So with all of that being said, progesterone is naturally going to do the exact opposite as to what estrogen did. Because again, going back to evolution, in an evolutionary sense, in order to procreate, we need to have high libidos. We need to have a high sex drive. We need to have more energy. And that's what estrogen gives us at our fertile time. Progesterone is high when we are infertile. Progesterone is high after ovulation. Ovulation is not going to happen again and only happens one time every cycle. And so progesterone rises after ovulation happens. And so when progesterone is high, it's preparing for a possible pregnancy. It's preparing your body for that possible pregnancy. So I like to use the image of a chicken who's just sitting on her eggs, right? This mother hen is nesting. She's giving warmth to those eggs. She's sitting and just nesting and being with her chicks and helping them grow. And that is exactly what our mood is often like in this latter half of our cycles. Because again, using the idea of this 30-day-ish cycle, this 4-week cycle, progesterone is going to be high for the last 2 weeks of your cycle. So if you ovulate around day 14, progesterone does not rise until after ovulation. So if you are sexually active during that fertile time, your body doesn't quite know yet whether or not you are pregnant. It takes about 2 weeks for your body to recognize if you're pregnant or not. So your body is going to pretend that you're pregnant just in case you are. And this goes for every single cycle, no matter whether you had sex during the fertile window or not. Your body is going to do this. So progesterone rises and it does two main things. It decreases your energy and it decreases your sex drive because of the fact that if you're already pregnant, there's no getting pregnant again. So and again, I'm using very, very generalized terms here, but if you're pregnant, you're not going to get pregnant again that cycle. You're already pregnant. So your body is just sitting and relaxing and maybe not all that interested in dating anymore. Your sex drive is not going to be as high because the deed is done. You're possibly pregnant, right? Or if you're not pregnant, again, your body is pretending that you are until it recognizes that it's not. So everything about progesterone is not for the sake of dating. It's for the sake of maintaining that possible pregnancy. So it takes, again, like I said, it takes the body about 2 weeks to determine the state of pregnancy. So if you are pregnant and your body says after ovulation, about 2 weeks after ovulation, oh, I am pregnant. I do need to keep this progesterone going because we need to keep this baby alive. We need to keep this pregnancy going. This is what is happening in your body. And so progesterone continues to rise. Now, another really cool thing is that the baby is also giving off progesterone because the baby also knows that he or she needs more progesterone to continue this pregnancy. So your progesterone will continue to rise, and that's why you don't have a period when you're pregnant. Now, if you're not pregnant, again, about 2 weeks after ovulation, your body recognizes that and says, oh, okay, I don't need all these things that I've been preparing for this possible pregnancy. So progesterone drops, and that's what triggers your next period. And then the whole thing happens all over again, right? So we have this ebb and flow of estrogen and progesterone. And so our bodies are naturally going to be more interested in dating, going to be more interested in looking attractive, going to be more interested in the quote unquote, what Dr. Hill says, sexy men, evolutionary speaking, for the sake of the continuation of our species. Now, progesterone, evolutionary speaking, is for the sake of continuation of a possible pregnancy. So we're not going to be as interested in dating during this time. especially right before our period, right? That's around the time that we're going to be feeling not our best because of progesterone having that natural drop and our period starting again. Now, I cannot mention progesterone and progesterone dropping without mentioning PMS, because of course PMS is also going to be a huge effect into our dating life. And let's say a guy asks us out on a date and we are like 2 days away from our period, right? Not to say we can't have fun, not to say that it's not going to be great. It could be a great date and that's perfectly fine, but your energy might not be at its peak and your interest in looking good might not be at its peak. And that's okay. That's not to say don't go on a date during this time. Not at all. But just to understand how naturally we might feel. So your decreased progesterone at the end of the menstrual cycle, right, that triggers your next period. Now, when we're talking about PMS though, PMS stands for premenstrual syndrome. And so some women have more severe symptoms right before their period that can actually lead to a diagnosable PMS. For somehow our culture has made PMS like a verb, like you're PMSing, but in all reality, PMS is a diagnosable thing. And it is due to low levels of progesterone. So progesterone has that natural drop at the end of your cycle if you're not pregnant. But if you are having an imbalance of progesterone where your progesterone either isn't getting high enough at all, or your progesterone levels are not staying high for long enough. So these two different things we can see that can cause some of these more severe PMS symptoms. So some of these could be like irritability, breast tenderness, bloating, weight gain, cravings, crying, headaches, fatigue, all of those things. If you're experiencing those symptoms or any sort of PMS symptoms for more than 3 days before your period, so you start to experience PMS symptoms more than 3 days before your period actually starts, this can actually be a sign of a diagnosable PMS, which means that there's a reason for that. Typically, it is because of low progesterone, which means it can actually be treated by supplementing it with bioidentical progesterone. So that's getting into another topic for another episode, but I cannot help but bring that up, especially because that can absolutely affect how our dates go. So PMS, if this sounds like you, by the way, where you're like, oh man, yeah, I've got like a week of crazy symptoms before my period starts, go see a good doctor that can actually evaluate your progesterone levels at the correct time. I'll put a link in the description below for some doctors that are actually trained in seeing your fertility charts and reading them and actually giving you more help than just putting you on the pill for this, because that's going to be the first round of treatment with conventional medicine, which I am very against. So anywho, I needed to bring that up. Okay, so recap really quick. Estrogen causes a high increase in energy, increase in sexual desire. Progesterone does the exact opposite. It totally decreases our energy and decreases our sexual desire and just gives us this mood to nest, just to be kind of be more inward and just rest. These are the natural ways that it affects our body. Now, I want to talk about this third hormone that I mentioned at the beginning, oxytocin. So oxytocin, you'll hear about it. It's kind of known as the love hormone. So the purpose of oxytocin is to actually bond us to another person. So oxytocin is released during a sexual encounter. Oxytocin is also released during childbirth and during breastfeeding, because it is our body's way of bonding us to our baby in that scenario. So now looking at this in the context of dating and marriage, we know that the strongest release of oxytocin toward a potential partner or toward your partner is released during the first time you're having sex. The first time. And what oxytocin does is it clues our brain to know that whoever you are bonding with at this moment is a very special person. This is our natural hormone makeup, oxytocin. The strongest release is during the first time that we have sex. And this clues our brain to know that the person we are encountering is a very special person. So this might be a topic for another episode, because I know that this is where I'm getting into very controversial topics, which clearly I don't shy away from. But yes, I do believe that per our body's design and per our body's makeup, that it makes biological sense even. Let's even put the morality of this aside, because obviously I have things about that to talk about too. But on a biological level, it makes sense for us to wait until our wedding night to have sex, because we want to make sure that the person, that our body is clued in to knowing that this is an incredibly important person. Who better than our spouse to be that person? Who better than the person that we have vowed to give our whole life to give our whole selves, our whole body to? Who better to clue our body to knowing who that person is than your spouse? Who better? So, again, I know that is a very lengthy topic, probably for another episode. But again, when we're talking about dating, I can't leave that out. Now, another glimpse into next week is that women who are on the pill actually don't react to oxytocin this strongly. And that's something that Dr. Sarah Hill actually talks about in her book on page 135, where she talks about oxytocin. So again, that's for next week, but I just want to put that out there. Now, oxytocin can act like duct tape. So when you think about duct tape, the first time you lay it on something, right, it's pretty sticky. I mean, it's kind of hard to get a duct tape off of something. And especially if you put it on your arm, right, it's going to pull out some hair when you pull that off, right? It's really sticky that first time. But then you pull it off, and then you put it back down on something else or on the same thing. Let's just talk about your arm, right? You put duct tape on your arm, you pull it off. Ow, that hurts. Okay. You put it on your arm again, the same spot. You pull it off again. Okay, maybe still a little bit painful, but not nearly as bad as the first. And you keep doing that over and over and over again. The stickiness wears off. You can kind of think of oxytocin in the same way, about how the strongest release of oxytocin is the first time that you have sex with someone. And then the next time a new partner comes into the scenario, that oxytocin release gets less and less and less. Now, I do not say this to take away any hope that if you are someone who has had multiple sex partners, but you have decided from here on out that you want to wait until that one person, until the person that you have committed your whole self to, you want to wait to give yourself again to that person. This oxytocin scenario is something that can be reversed. Now, it takes time, and it takes your body some abstinence to recover from that, but it can be reversed so that you can give your whole self to your husband on your wedding night and have your body be clued in to knowing that that is an important person. So I don't want you to lose hope by now knowing this about oxytocin and about how it affects your sexual life. But it is an incredibly important hormone that biologically bonds us to that one person. So with that being said, when I'm talking about your dating life, there's different ways of looking at that depending on your religious preferences or depending on your moral code or your ethics or just depending on your worldview. Dating life, that term looks so different for many different people. But clearly, if you've been listening up to this point, you can tell that I have what my specific worldview of this looks like. So I want to go over really quick, okay, what do we do about this? Because if I'm making the argument that you should be waiting to have sex until you're married, then how in the world do we date when we are in our fertile time? Because I've already outlined how we have a naturally higher libido, a higher sex drive during that fertile time. How in the world are we supposed to expect to be dating people during that time and not having sex with them? Because our body is naturally inclined to do that. Okay, well, let's take a look at that. Obviously, we know that a higher libido equals an easier arousal. Okay, we know that. I want to discuss the difference between a feeling versus an action. Okay, so in themselves, your feelings or your passions are amoral. They are neither good nor evil. They're just passions. They're just feelings. They're there. Okay, they are not morally qualified, meaning they are not given a morality until they have had an action placed on them. Okay. So what does that mean, right? We experience something. We experience this high libido. Okay. High libido is amoral. That is a biologically, that is something that biologically happens during different times of our cycle. So that passion or that feeling in itself is neither good nor evil, but it is the action that is placed on top of that feeling or passion. It's what we choose to do with that feeling or action that qualifies whether it is good or evil. So let me pull back here really quick and let's just talk about an example that's not having to do with sex. Let's talk about anger. Okay. I have 3 kids. I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And I am so incredibly grateful and blessed, and I love them to absolute death. But there are days when I'm kind of running around like a chicken with my head cut off. And there are days that I can get impatient, and that's something I need to work on. And there are days that impatience or that feeling of distractedness and that feeling of anger and that feeling of frustration and impatience, those feelings are, I mean, who wouldn't feel that way? Those feelings are not bad in of themselves. But if I decide to take those feelings and start yelling and screaming at my kids, that's when the moral action changes, right? That's when things get serious. I can also act in a different way. I can excuse myself for just a few minutes and collect myself, collect my thoughts and actions, and then come back out when I'm ready and when I'm calm to actually manage the situation then, right? Those are 2 different ways that I can handle those feelings. So those feelings in and of themselves, it's not bad, it's not good, it's natural. It's what's there because of the natural situation that I'm in. But the way that I act on those feelings, on those passions, that's where it gets to whether I'm making a good decision or a bad decision. So now translating this then into this increased sexual arousal during this fertile time. Okay, that feeling of arousal, it's not bad. It would actually be unnatural to have them. It would be unnatural to not feel arousal, especially during this time. But this feeling, the actions that are based on this feeling that you have, they must be rightly ordered toward what is good. And so with that being said, this is where the argument comes into, okay, you're feeling this high sexual arousal. Okay, that actually means that your body is healthy. Congratulations. But if you have made the decision to wait until your wedding, well, then let's take a look at that. Let's see, okay, what scenarios should I be placing myself in to make sure that I can still make that good and right decision for myself? So maybe that's, okay, I go on a date, great. Maybe I don't go into his house to watch a movie. Maybe we don't do a movie night that night. Maybe we don't, actually, here's a good example. When my husband and I were dating, we had a hard and fast rule that we were not allowed in each other's bedrooms, just point blank. And that was super helpful for us to be able to make that decision to wait to give ourselves to each other as a renewal of the vows that we've made at our wedding day. So that is just one example of those, right? But anywho, with all that being said, the feeling of the high estrogen, high energy, high sex drive feelings that you have, those are good. They are natural. But the way that you act on those feelings is what makes the action good or not good. Okay, I'm trying to kind of decide where I want to go from here because I've talked about a lot of different things in this episode and all good things. And I'm very passionate and I feel like I could be going a bunch of different directions right now. But I think what I want to end on is my all-time favorite quote from a man named Fulton Sheen. And he was actually a Catholic bishop back in I think the 40s and 50s. You can fact check me on that. But he has this quote from a book that he wrote talking about how much power women have to affect our culture. It's incredible. Okay, so buckle up. Here's the quote. When a man loves a woman, he has to become worthy of her. The higher her virtue, the more noble her character, the more devoted she is to truth, justice, goodness, the more a man has to aspire to be worthy of her. The history of civilization could actually be written in terms of the level of its women. End quote. Let that sink in, y'all. The history of civilization could actually be written in terms of the level of its women. Oh my word. What this means is that when you have made a decision to uphold your dignity and to recognize how important you are and how worthy you are and how much dignity you have, when you have made that decision and you have seen the inherent goodness of yourself, that makes men have to be worthy of you. It makes men have to stand up for that same truth, justice, and goodness that you have been devoted to. So the higher that you set your expectations, the higher that you set your goals, the higher that you set your standards, is the higher that men have to reach to become worthy of you. So why do we continuously settle? Why do we continuously say that sex means nothing? It is a lie. Sex is a giving of our whole selves to another person. And biologically, it is saying that this person that I am giving my whole self to you is an incredibly special person. So why do we not can keep that standard so that the men in our lives can rise to that? We can do the men around us a great justice by hiring those standards and by expecting those standards to be met. And when they're not, you guys, that is time to let go of that man. And it is time to recognize that your dignity, you have an inherent dignity, but it also needs to be upheld. And the man that you have given your whole self to should be a man that reaches that standard to support and protect your dignity at all costs. I'm going to end with that today. Thank you guys for reaching the end of this and hearing you guys, it's passion. It is passion. Okay. Next week, I'm coming at you with how the pill affects all of this. So stay tuned for that, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. If you are enjoying this content, it would be amazing if you could leave a 5-star review. That helps me tremendously to be able to continue to produce these episodes for you. Remember that these podcasts are available on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon, and YouTube. And you can always go to my website, truthandfertility.com, to learn more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week.